Friends, the issue we are discussing here, that is why cooperatives? What is the need for cooperatives? We are having very efficient corporations. There are corporations who have changed the very way of life. The corporations who are providing very good quality products, many good services they are providing. Then why are we talking of cooperatives? No doubt, we are having large corporations, good corporations. They are providing very good quality things, but at what cost? They are charging a very heavy cost. Not only the apparent cost, but the real cost they are incurring on the society. Then putting multiple inefficiencies in the name of quality in the system, in terms of pollution, in terms of intoxication, in terms of poisoning the whole system, in terms of whether it be the nature or it be the health or so many things. These costs are worrying us. Cooperatives are basically people-oriented institutions. They have to be run by the people. Cooperatives are the one of the important tools of economic democracy. Just like in the political system, what does this democracy means? A very essential element of democracy is that there has to be one man, one vote. That is in the political system. The cooperatives implement this approach, this element in the economic sector also. One man, one vote. That is the difference with the corporations. Corporations, in that the principle is one share, one vote. The more the shares you have in the company, the more votes you have. The more capital you hold, the more strong position you are there. But here in cooperatives, for dividend purpose you may be getting proportionate dividend, but for voting purpose you have equal rights. One man, one vote. That is the one of the basic elements of cooperatives. We are talking about cooperatives. That doesn't mean that all the enterprises will have to be finished, all the companies will be closed, and just there will be cooperatives in every sector. That is not the sense here. Actually, cooperatives are suitable for medium level activities, middle level enterprises. Smaller activities can be held by the private corporation, private companies or private entrepreneurs. And for the larger activities, for larger projects, there may be some kind of joint ownership between the government and the private sector, as well as the social institutions. They are also to be given, the NGOs particularly, they have to be given representation in our economic activities. They are in waiting position for this. So that has to be ensured. And the reality is that cooperative is prevailing in many sectors of the society, but that has not been properly propagated because of this capitalist media. The capitalist media has been overemphasizing the failures of cooperatives, but it has not properly make the people understand the real successes of cooperatives, because the advertising industry is in the hands of the corporates and they propagate the failures of cooperatives too much, but the successes are suppressed somehow. But the cooperatives are the most successful silent revolution in the world. They are silent revolution. They have brought silent revolution. And in the countries where cooperatives have been working effectively, they are the most prosperous countries these days so far. Then we have to think of this. And not only the high technology we are talking about, we see every day, the high technology, that is the enterprise resource planning softwares, ERP, extra price softwares, extra price level softwares, that is the collaborative commerce we are seeing these days. Collaborative softwares are there. the companies, large corporations are bound to use collaborative softwares. What is this? This is also, I think, an electronic version of cooperation. And when the large corporations are not able to work on their own, they have to cooperate with others. They have to integrate with their supply chain, along their supply chain. They have to integrate along their customer relationship. Then what about the common people? Even the corporations are not able to work on their own. They have to develop certain integration. I came from India to here, and I had to change my flight 3 times. And each flight is run by some other corporation. They have a network, they have a common network. Such large corporations can maintain their own individual network, they can maintain their individual ego, but they are having a collaborative network. They have divided their own area. They know very well what is my area, which is the area of my core competency, and rest of the activities have to be given to some other organization. So when the corporations, these large, mighty, monstrous corporations are not able to work on their own, and they have to cooperate with other entities, then what about the common people? If the common people don't cooperate amongst themselves, if they don't develop cooperatives, they cannot survive. But the problem with cooperatives has been, particularly for example in my country, India, the registered cooperatives or formal cooperatives have been a failure. And that is why now there is informal cooperatives all over India, which are called self-help groups, SHGs. So these SHGs are quite popular now in our country, and but we are not satisfied with that. Again, we have to move, we have to redirect these SHGs towards coordinated cooperation. Because a cooperation which is prevailing so far, that is subordinated cooperation, where the cooperatives are working in subordination to the government organizations, to the corporations, but these subordinated cooperatives have to be converted into coordinated cooperatives. Without coordinated cooperation, without placing the cooperatives, without positioning the cooperatives in the mainstream, we cannot ensure balanced and sustainable betterment of the people and their lives. So that is why we have to emphasize cooperatives. That cooperatives are not untouched by the corporate world, but corporate world is exploiting these cooperatives for its own ends, for its own heavy greed for profit. But we have to utilize this cooperative spirit for the overall benefit of all the people. And here again, that doesn't mean that cooperatives will not earn profit. Cooperatives have to earn profit. We have to ensure that they earn profit, otherwise they cannot survive. But this profit has not to be at the cost of the people's welfare, at the cost of the society. The greed for profit has to be controlled. The cooperatives have to work along the lines of fair profit and by serving the people. So this customer orientation, this service orientation has to be ensured in our cooperative enterprises. In that way also we can ensure coordinated cooperation. So that coordinated cooperation is getting emphasized. This talk about the Prout philosophy. This Prout philosophy also emphasizes too much this coordinated cooperation. And the propounder of this philosophy was very much particular, very much specific to this issue that to ensure morality in the cooperatives, it is quite necessary that we have to ensure proper level of spirituality. Spirituality, morality without the basis of spirituality is quite fragile. That will not work. That will be temporary. A person who is claiming to be moral, honest, he will be easily tempted by small benefits. For that, this spiritual base is very important for that running of the cooperatives properly. So with this, I thank you all that you have given me this opportunity.
And I'm sure we'll be able to get into more detail with the questioning, because I'm sure people will have lots of questions about how Prout actually works and operates in India on the ground, the practical applications. Our last presenter, but by no means our least presenter, is Dr. Ian McPherson, who is the Director of British Columbia Institute for Cooperative Studies and at the University of Victoria, British Columbia. Are you trying to fudge me now, huh?
I think for him, he really is.
12 minutes, all right. I'll concede 12 minutes.
Topic is why cooperatives and localization. After the first session today, I went out the building, and as my wife will tell me is my want, I didn't have the faintest idea where I was going. And so I turned to a young fellow and asked if he knew where Russell was. He wasn't sure. We asked two more, and that's the party we all came. So why cooperation? The one answer is because we are cooperative. We constantly are barraged with the idea we're competitive. In my society, we teach our children to about grade 2 or 3 cooperate, right? Then grade 4 says, get your shoes on, you've got to get the marks to get to law school. You know? And it's ridiculous. Anyway. So that's one answer. It's just an outgrowth of who we are. Second one that occurs to me is as commonly put forward, is that co-ops appear because of failures in the system. That's this kind of standard economist explanation. In other words, when they grow up, they will surely do something important, but they'll convert. They'll demutualize and become real business people. A lot of that around these days. Extensions of class, clear in many parts of the world. Manifestations of experience. When people came onto the prairies or the plains, they had to cooperate. Otherwise, they weren't going to have schools. They weren't going to have a store, perhaps. You can go on. Frontier experience is there. Get it really. I keep meaning to look up what Commonwealth really means in American history. I think it's actually quite fascinating. I've seen some glimpses of it, you know. The Commonwealth is applied to different states. Why? Why? I mean, I have some explanation of that. And a huge intentional community tradition. I've spoken to 4 people here who have been, these are the people I've talked to. I don't know how it came up. They come from intentional communities. Big experience in your country, maybe as much as anywhere else in the world. There are 700 of them that agreed to be associated together. I'm sure there's a big number out there that don't like to be associated. That's what they are. And then I could say it's co-op thought and practice. It does exist. It's not well understood. It's not commonly explored. It didn't win out too well in the struggles against Marxist analysis or liberal analysis or conservative or the other big bodies of thought that in the age of ideologies swept the stage. It was always marginalized or occasionally used. Sometimes it would be useful for that to happen. However, many people have been motivated by cooperative thought. I used to call them cooperative utopians until I realized what exactly that meant. I realized why Carl used it for the anarchists and others. And I don't agree with that. But anyway, so I don't call it a real exercise often that we periodically engage in. Not something that's serious. So as Shu and co-ops too. And the use of the surplus is the way that is done. So there are, in fact, I think, many kinds of cooperation. And there's spontaneous, which is what happened with our 4 colleagues this morning. There's automatic. I get a lot of automatic cooperation as I get a little older. People kind of open the door for me and all of that. And I don't mind it, actually. And traditional. And there's directed cooperation. Okay? Classrooms normally. A classroom is a form of directed cooperation when you think about it for a minute. At least I think a good classroom is, as opposed to dictatorial classrooms, right? And then there's legislative cooperation. So there's a lot of sources on why cooperatives exist, why there are 800 million people or more involved in cooperatives. And India has one of the most interesting co-op movements in the world. You have one of the most interesting co-op movements in the world here in the United States. So that's my answer to why cooperatives. I could go on for 3 hours, and if you all want to meet outside this evening, I can do that for you, but I won't wait too long. The second dimension of it was localization, because what I left out of that discussion was the local dimension of cooperatives. And I want to do a little bit of something on the board. We have to do it really quickly. Middle of the 19th century, it was becoming more and more apparent to many people that there was something wrong. And low praise, we worked just like you do back at the University of Victoria. Many people tended to refer to what was going on as the social question, defined a little differently, but it boiled down to this. Why, amid so much prosperity, is there so much poverty? Right? How is that possible? Well, there are many answers, of course. You know, and the big ideologies were a part of that. This co-op answer. We heard some really interesting comments about a worker co-op approach. Economists are taking the worker co-op approach more seriously than any other time. Right? How you could restructure society on the basis of work. Right? Very common idea. Labor theory of value and all that. Another one, you could restructure society on the basis of consumption. Yeah, that's not such a wild idea now. It would have sounded silly 20 years ago, but now, you know, look at that cafeteria. You could restructure on the basis of finance. A lot of discussion now about ethical funding and that sort of thing. Well, you could take it even farther than that and have the democratization of money, the democratization of consumption and the worker, or agriculture. And you've got to put that in a context, because it wasn't just the production of better carrots; it was a way of life. And there's a lot, or you can call it, you can trivialize it, called the rural myth. But there's a lot that wasn't mythic in what they were trying to talk about. And there are others as well. These are co-op versions. So you could say that you could, on a local level, start to reform the world. And people believed that at one time. Right? To cooperatives. The issue becomes... Oh, okay. The issues that come up for me in all of this is that these alternatives have never really been looked at and considered seriously and in depth. The thinkers, this is a tremendous problem in being involved with co-ops, is that you tend to get on a board of a co-op. So you spend your days wondering about what you should be doing in that co-op, and you're going to get away from this. And that praxis is very complex in the co-op world. Very, you know, it's fine to sit in a room, but when you're out trying to organize an organic food co-op, it's a problem. It's a challenge. And the theoretical base is weak. That's why I hope where I am to help to make a contribution deeply in that. We don't understand very well. There were some issues brought up today that are classic issues in co-ops, and I heard some of the others too. You know, as you go through the formation to the stabilization to the building phases to, I have a kind of a, this is my characterization of what tends to happen, to the crisis that occurs, and then the rebuilding. The interesting thing about co-ops is that they have staying power. Many of them are very old. It's not hard to find 100-year-old co-ops. Right? So, the localization issue, in a sense, becomes almost a problem for co-ops because you get so involved in those local issues and those local problems. But its manifestations of local interests and its variations in local needs It's a very flexible model, and has always been. It's not the only model. There are various ways in which communities can help themselves, but it's one. And I think I see the hand descending. Oh, I saw it. So the point I'm getting at is that if you look, one of the most interesting things for me in my life has been to go to, and I've been privileged, a person in our house say I've gone overboard a little bit, but I've been able to see co-ops in a lot of places. And the difference between cooperatives I've seen in different parts of India versus my country, or Venezuela, I heard people talking about that this very today. They're immense. And why are they? It's because they reflect cultures, and they reflect local circumstance. So you have a framework. But one of the mixes in trying to understand that connection is that. The last point I want to make about localization is that the biggest challenge for co-ops in many ways has been to try to figure out how to take that influence they can create on a local level and amass it. There have been notable successes. I've heard Mondragon mentioned. One example. Northern Italy today. The British movement. It's always been a kind of I've often wondered about it, because I've actually traced where he lived and where he went, or where I believe he lived. Frederick Engels lived in Manchester, the latter part of the 19th century, a little bit upward. The time he lived there, the co-op movement grew from virtually nothing to the point where it fed a quarter of the British population. It owned more land than the Queen. It owned 20-some factories, developed on a worker co-partnership basis. It had its own bank. It had its own insurance company. It had overseas connections that were quite remarkable. And yet, in Engels and in Carl's work, it's a very ambivalent attitude toward co-ops. The younger and the older Marx have different views, and as we all do. But it's always been an interesting thing to me, because it happens, as you were saying, it's kind of a quiet revolution. Right? You have the notion, fight, I think the book has arrived, the fight for economic democracy. Right? In some ways, it's also a coming together for economic democracy. Right? Thank you so much.
Thank you. So I want to thank you all for coming back. I want to thank the panelists and thank David for his opening presentation. And I just want to add a couple of remarks to it. I don't know if you're familiar with Yes Magazine. It's a magazine I highly recommend. This issue has an article in it about Winona LaDuke. And Winona LaDuke is sort of revising the co-op of wild rice harvesting amongst her people. And the interesting thing, some of the dynamics that we're talking about is economic integrity, which also goes with co-ops. How do you keep the corporate world from stealing what the people have brought into being, which is a fight that they're struggling with there, because they're harvesting authentic wild rice, and we're able to have laws passed to say that wild rice has to be harvested in a particular way, but only in their state, so that in California and other places, they are still doing corporate farming of rice and have the ability to name Uncle Ben's rice wild rice. So you have also that competition with the corporate and the capitalist market, which is always looking to steal good ideas, wherever they come from. Then you have things like the Southern Cooperative of Black Farmers, which exists down south, which is fighting to hold on to farmland, but in order to circumvent NAFTA and to open up new markets, began partnerships with farmers in Mexico, in Guatemala, and Honduras, so that they could circumvent NAFTA, trade with each other, and have worked out an agreement to service in those, so that they cross-service each other's markets when their growing season is out of season. So when they can no longer grow a particular crop in the south to supply, to deliver to their suppliers, they get it from Mexico or Guatemala, and Guatemala and Mexico does the same. A sort of reciprocal cooperative that goes across borders. You know, we all probably know child care cooperatives. Cooperatives work within families where they pool their money together in a large family to buy groceries or to buy other commodities to be used within the family. I think cooperatives are probably the oldest form of organizing our money and organizing our consumerism and our need for things. So we're going to open the floor up to you for questions. You are pleased to direct them at the panel in general, or if you have a particular person you would like to comment. And don't everyone jump in at one time. We're going to fight you off. We're going to hold you back.
I have a comment.
All right.
Okay. I know there's been, there's a lot of philosophies going around about how to localize and all that. And I heard some talk today about, doing it from within the system, from the top down, or incorporating all aspects of it from the top to the bottom, keeping it all within the system. But I have real difficulty seeing how that can work, because the historically government has been resistant to changing the status quo, largely because these global corporations are lining the pockets of the politicians and all their appointees, and so I don't see that happening. I think the only way that it can happen is from a grassroots level, on local levels, all local levels, and and that involves, even if you have a across the board grassroots level, like say for instance, Food Not Bombs started as a really small notion, and it has become global, and with the support of a lot of the population, but not really so much support from the government in this country especially. And but nonetheless, it started out as a grassroots level, on a grassroots level, and that's the way I think that localization of markets and localization of economy has to happen. We have to quit buying at McDonald's and Walmart and the Gap, and in our society, I understand that we can't be 100% local, but we can greatly diminish our dependence on the global marketplace by taking the investment on the local level to do it. And even some of the things that we can't have locally everywhere can be turned into locally in specific areas. For instance, even the steel industry could be turned into a local economy at the areas where it's possible, rather than it being controlled by multinational or global corporations. And that also goes with some seasonal farm products and things like that. It's gotten to be where we're shipping food halfway around the world. It doesn't have to be that way. We destroy good food right here in the United States and call it weeds, by calling it weeds, when in fact some of them are more nutritious than the stuff we replace it with in our gardens.
Would you like to respond?
Yeah, and
Let's get into some responses. Our time for general dialogue is a bit short
Yeah.
right now.
sorry, yeah.
Well, I could say just the first part of your talk about, Carl and I were actually talking about that very issue as we were walking over to dinner, that what should be done without government, spontaneously, locally, and to what extent you rely on government. And I want to argue, you need both. In fact, when I talk about economic democracy, I say there's two slogans. Democratize work, democratize labor, cooperatives, democratize capital. But the third one is you've got to democratize democracy as well. I mean, you've got to work to get this system that is formally democratic more genuinely democratic by campaign finance reform, and we've got to somehow break the hold of corporate power on the political system, okay? But at the same time, you know, you need to be, you can't wait, you know, for the political process to be completely reformed. You need also to be experimenting on the ground. But there's a role for both local governments, national governments. For example, just to give you a concrete example, one of the things that flows out of my analysis is the need for a capital assets tax. Okay? Now that's something that could be put on a political platform right now. Everybody knows corporations pay no taxes anymore. You know, they used to pay quite a bit. The corporate income tax used to generate quite a bit of revenue. But now, particularly since they've gone global, you can do transfer pricing. You can always make it look like you're not making any money in the country that you're operating in, so you don't have to pay any tax. Well, how about an assets tax? You can't hide from that one. Just say, what's the value of your capital on January 1st? What's the value of your stock? You know, look on, you know, New York Stock Exchange. What was it worth? How many shares are outstanding? Multiply those two numbers. That's the value of your capital assets tax. We're going to tax that. Okay, a small percent, but all of that money then could be generated, first of all, collectively, and then put back into communities and earmarked into communities. This is going to local governments to do something to help set up, create employment in your region, help fund worker-run enterprises, help workers that want to buy their enterprise. I mean, there are things like that that you can do. You need government, but you don't want to wait for government. And the more local things that are going on to start with, the better your case is for having the government get involved, because if you can look and say, well, look, this worked here and that worked here, why don't we have more of those in our community? You know, so, I mean, I think you got to keep this dialectical.
I was wondering, how likely is it that our government is going to pass an assets tax in my lifetime?
There is, I would posit excuse me.
Oh, I was just
No,
saying,
go right
I
ahead.
say likely. But
He says like, but I would say there is a deep contradiction between true democracy and a corporate-dominated economy. There is a deep contradiction between a localized economy and a corporate-dominated economy. There is a deep contradiction between enterprise that is owned and managed by the workers and a corporate-dominated economy. There are profound differences of values and agendas that are there, and the influence that the corporate economy has on the state right now is comparatively great. Now, I would agree with David that there is all kinds of scope to create models. Models are hugely important. They're vital. There is as well humanizing tendencies within the corporate world, here and there. There are people interested in these ESOPs. There is more participatory management going on. There is a triple bottom line. There are people in the corporate world who are very aware that capitalism has to evolve. But all of that said, to get to your question, how likely is it that the government is going to prosper policies that will privilege the corporate sector the cooperative sector over the corporate sector? I think that is a big question that needs to be looked at deeply. I do not see it being a smooth transition on the whole, though I admit that as many models as we can generate within the framework of the old is vitally important. But that gets into the subject of revolution, and which Ravi talked about a bit this morning, and it's a much bigger subject.
Actually, real changes don't come from the government side. Governments are easily purchased by the corporations and capitalists. They are bound to be purchased by the capitalists and the corporations. The real changes do come from the people's side. It is the people's determination, it is the people's strong determination which leads to the real changes. And when the people have such a feeling that this has to be done, then that will be done sooner or later. For that, so far as localization, the issue is localization. This localization is only to ensure that every area is able to ensure balanced development. It is able to utilize the resources in the best possible manner. Localization does not mean that each and every area will become equal. All the fingers are never equal. but the distance difference between the fingers should not be so that the hand is quite unable to work in proper way. So that there should be proper proportion between the differences we have. The differences should not be beyond those proportions. That is, localization has to ensure these two things.
I think that there's a tremendous need to keep looking at taxation issues and at regulatory regimes, because by and large they're not sympathetic, whether it's cooperative or other forms of community-based activities and enterprises. You know, there's a real gap. There ain't a level playing field out there, to put it in another person's language. You can, so that has to be done. But there's also a need to reactivate and to think carefully and to help and to provide opportunities for people in communities to do these things. And there's a lot, you know, this is a country, and my country too, this has a strong volunteer tradition and a good sense of public service, you know. It exists, we all know them. So, but to mobilize that, I mean, our educational institutions, my line is, every university in Canada has 56 average business profs, right, on average. There's not even an average of one that deals with co-ops across the country. And the same, but then there are many other things. I belong to another co-chair, an effort to create a social economy, which has many similarities to this. And that whole notion of how you can restructure economic thought, it's just so hard to bridge, you know. But that's what we need to, partly what we need to do too. So I would say, how do you mobilize, how do you train people, and how do we reorient our whole way of economic thinking, which should be by way of, I mean, I'm not an economist.
In terms of this top-down versus bottom-up question, all that I would add to the discussion is the threat of a good example. If you start from the bottom-up reforms, you know, with co-ops being formed and then forming their own networks and so on, that can catch hold as a paradigm and spark similar things throughout the economy, throughout the society. As that starts to happen, the growing political power of that model, the credibility of that model, can cause government to start being more amenable to reforms and ameliorate the influence, reduce the influence of corporations. Look at what happens with Venezuela, you know. Venezuela decides to pursue a nationalist policy after so many years of being under the thumb of the United States. And it starts catching fire in other countries around the region, and pretty soon now you've got a regional economic institution coming out of that that's going to replace the IMF's role in funding development throughout those countries.
Yeah, I
And
agree.
one moment, please. We gotta get everybody in, I'm sorry. Yes, ma'am.
Oh, I was talking about the intellectual property rights. I want to know about that, intellectual property rights of cooperatives. Is there an issue at all that's ever talked about that? I know India had a problem with curry, that somebody, and with the curry issue that somebody was trying to take away or improve on the curry. And I really wish I could say more about that, but it sounds familiar. Is there a property with intellectual property rights and cooperatives? Or is that not an issue?
I'll say one thing briefly.
Business is not intellectual property.
One thing briefly is that inventors should get more of the rewards of their invention, and then that intellectual property should be distributed. That would be the likely approach used in a cooperative dominated economy.
Big issue is the property rights of seed. Huge issue, because what it tends to do is to make it more feasible for the half dozen groupings that control food distributions around the world to control that. And small independent producers have a series of problems as a result of that.
That's what I was
No doubt intellectual property has to be respected. Creativity and intellectual property, these are to be respected. But not to the level of exploitation. In the name of, if a company is inventing something and then it is charging exorbitantly up to the exploitative level, then you will have to control that also.
I would also say, I mean, just intellectual property is a massive scam right now. I I think. You know, I mean, the core rationale, yeah, you need, you know, to give incentives to inventors so they can, you know, recoup their time and effort and make some money, but vast amounts of intellectual property have nothing to do with that, you know. And in particular, I think we need to reform intellectual property laws. And I think intellectual property ought to be free for poor countries. I mean, there's enough incentives, you know, for developing things for rich countries. Okay, you can have intellectual property there, but though that kind of intellectual property ought to be made free, you know. And I argue in my book, particularly in an economic democracy where you don't have to worry about the low-wage competition, you could easily make all of this, you know, free to other countries, and we should be doing that. Right now, it's a massive scam. The U.S. has been pushing that, you know, big time.
In terms of that issue, Vandana Shiva is the person, you know, who you want to look up if you haven't already. She's the one who has done all the work on the illegitimate patenting of life forms by companies like Monsanto, which then attempt to take those abilities to use those life forms away from farmers throughout India who are farming in their little plots. And it's outrageous, and it is an ethical issue, and it should be addressed by cooperatives. Cooperatives should certainly, in their own ethical, rules, prohibit this from any of their members. When they're confronted with it, that's where I think you've got a real struggle. This is where you get to the point where Frederick Douglass said, "Power concedes nothing without a demand." At that point, you're going to hit the wall. You've got to actually have a struggle at that point, just like Shiva is doing with the communities in India. These co-ops that we're talking about are going to have to struggle against that too. If they want to use certain, you know, grow certain foods or whatever, and they've been considered to be patented by these hijackers, that has to be confronted at a governmental level, and that's going to be this gradual interplay between the localities and the government, the local co-ops and the government. And as the co-ops grow in influence, hopefully they'll be more effective in that and taking their case to the public on that too.
I'm going to take another question.
Yes, as we're talking about systems of people, as those systems as cooperatives may become more and more powerful, there is, of course, the tendency of use taking more power into itself. So what are the experiences and systems in place in large and effective co-ops that continue to do profit sharing and serve the needs of people and develop that moral and spiritual leadership to ensure their longevity?
Examples.
Well, one of the best is probably the Mondragon Federation. The Mondragon Cooperative Federation in the vast region of Spain. And it began in the late 50s. There's maybe a couple hundred cooperatives, both manufacturing cooperatives and service cooperatives in that complex. I'm sure Ian can speak to this much more than I can, but it's had remarkable enduring power. Though with the creation of the European Union, it has come up with the increasing pressures created by economic globalism, and some of the remarkable wage equality that was initially there in the Mondragon system has been attenuated somewhat. I think the wage ratio was 3-to-1 initially, and now it's degenerated to 7 to 1.
6 to 1 when I read it.
Now. But just say a bit about Mondragon. It's an enormously important experiment that most people have never heard of, and yet I think it's a world historic experiment. This group of little cooperatives, founded by a Roman Catholic priest back in 1956, is now the 6th largest corporation in Spain. It's the 3rd largest employer in all of Spain. It's got branches all over the world right now. Now, they have made compromises, okay? A lot of the branches, in fact, none of the branches are full cooperatives. But there's also a debate going on in Mondragon about this issue, about how to keep our values alive and so on and so forth when we're forced, because we have to compete with these multinationals, to expand out of our region and do the sorts of things that they do. But one of the crucial differences is, you know, the Mondragon cooperatives are committed to increasing employment. You never, ever see a Mondragon cooperative in Spain say, well, let's move, you know, to somewhere else where wages are cheaper. You know, you keep your employment at home. You try to create additional employment at home. but you also set up things that can be done elsewhere cheaper. So there are compromises can be made, but this debate goes on. I mean, it's going on, you know, in the cooperatives themselves all the time, and I think it's part of
How to keep
what-
the integrity.
We
of the
can't do a
tradition.
follow-up, I'm sorry.
Wait, can I say one more thing?
One thing,
I'm looking
I'm
at,
gonna get one more question in.
I'm looking at a
We need-
website right now that I just brought up for the Mondragon University. And part of their program is to educate people in the cultural heritage of the Basque country that they live in. So it's to preserve this, you know, sense of cultural integrity. That's part of the mission of the group. It's taken on that role within the society. It's not a purely economic institution anymore.
I don't think it's a simple answer to your question. It really isn't. We're dealing with human beings, and they wrestle. The one thing a cooperative should offer is there's a framework within which it cannot be ignored internally. You know,
Right.
so and shifts happen. And the British movement is a good example of that. There are others as well. The Mondragon is wrestling with this, which is an issue they created. I was there when they did making decisions. I saw grown men weep on in discussions because of what it meant. And it was, and then three of the founders, and they differed for the first time in their whole lives over that whole issue. I think they have 12 factories in the United States right now.
Wow. Yes.
Thank you. We have a food co-op in my city, but for those in my community who maybe aren't going to be content to wait until there's some kind of national awakening in the United States to where, you know, some interest is given to co-ops, what is it that we can do legally, locally? Is there any experience with, you know, influencing, for example, you know, your local government to provide some kind of support for cooperatives and things like that, or things that people can do? Again, you know, barring Food Not Bombs, for example, which, you know, takes matters into its own hands, you know, much to its credit, I think. But, you know, are there things that we can do on a local level to initiate this process?
But you can work with other people in the community. Actually, this is a question we're trying to address at our institute right now for a variety of reasons. But you can work with other people in the community. And I'm going to risk offending some people here, and I'm sorry if I do that. I think the United States was a great leader in the co-op development of organic foods. I mean, you were way ahead. And now you have an industry that is increasingly dominated by others. Well, and that's, you know, more people are eating organic food, so that's good, assuming the evaluation is right, you know, that's good. But I have to stand back and say, well, now why? Why did that leadership move somewhere else? And I see the same thing happening in fair trade. We did a little conference on fair trade, and you know, there are co-ops in Colombia who sell to co-ops and communicate through. I mean, the role of co-ops in the fair trade internationally is quite dramatic, but they're not pulling together. Okay? They're not honoring the sixth principle of cooperating among cooperatives and getting it. And it's a problem of moving from the local to the bigger. Again, we come up against this. But I weep a little bit over organic food because it should have been a co-op. It's still significant. Every American city I've been to pretty well, I can find an organic food co-op. My family says I'm very good at finding co-ops.
Give a nose for him. In the community I live in the late 70s, there were probably 20 cooperatives, consumer producer, banking, housing cooperatives, if not more. And now there are maybe 3 or 4.
And so co-op studies would say, why? What happened? It's not a bad thing when co-ops disappear. It happens. People change. Life goes on. But why so many? You know, and that's a dramatic one. But the co-ops have a better record of getting through the organizational and often the stabilizing phase. But then something happens when people get older and they decide it's better to go camping on the weekend.
What we're talking about with organic food is a niche market, right? With particular people who are aware of the issue, concerned about the issue, and they're going to make a commitment. This is a small group. When the co-op movement, you know, for organic food first came into being, it was no doubt due to a small group of concerned people who were really intensely interested in this issue. It wasn't big enough for the corporations to take an interest in it, and that's why the co-ops, with all the disadvantages that I mentioned in my presentation, were still able to prevail. But once you got past that tender phase, and you had, the expansion of interest in organic food, the big corporations decided it was interesting to them, and they moved in with all of their advantages, and they partially crushed that movement. And that's the problem. It's a very severe problem that we're facing in this movement. Really,
The other thing that's really interesting
a lot of
about
creativity to deal with that.
interesting about these consumer organic food co-ops, I call them, is that those divisions became quite distinct. Silos crept in between agricultural, banking, consumer, worker co-ops. But they bridged two at least. Okay? Sometimes they bridged three: worker, agricultural, and consumer. Which was
Start a co-op and things that nobody's interested in.
Can we give our panelists, our speaker, a round of applause? There are other sessions that are starting at 2, so we want to make sure that you can get there. I want to say I really appreciate Ian's remarks about fair trade, cooperative, because it's very important that we don't become isolationist around this problem, because the greatest way that we can work with other countries is cooperative, citizen to citizen, to build a true global free society. Thank you all.